Hello, my name is Farah Guerrero, and this is the Blue Hour on CITR 101.9 FM in Vancouver. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the two places connected to this episode. This conversation was pre-recorded in Whistler on the shared, unceded territories of the Squamish and Lillooet nations. The episode is being broadcast from the University of British Columbia on the traditional ancestry and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I offer this acknowledgement with respect for these distinct nations, their histories, and the many Indigenous peoples whose territories shape the places where we speak, listen, learn, and gather. In this episode of the Blue Hour, I speak with Dr. Sonia Del Re, Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings at the National Gallery of Canada. Sonia Del Re holds a master's degree in museology and a PhD in art history. She joined the National Gallery's curatorial team in 2006, and today she oversees a remarkable collection of almost 30,000 works of art on paper created around the world between the 15th and 20th centuries. Her curatorial work spans Dutch landscapes, the Carracci, Chagall, Pre-Raphaelite drawings, Picasso's Vollard suite, Venetian portraiture, early European monsters, and most recently, gathered leaves, discoveries from the drawings vault. In our conversation, we speak about drawings, prints, the life of the vault, curatorial research, and what works on paper we can reveal about artists, history, and the intimate life of images. Hello, Sonia. Welcome to the Blue Hour.
Thank you so much for having me, Farah.
So I would like to begin with the continuity between your academic life and your curatorial life. So your doctoral research was on Utrecht Caravagism, Caravaggio the body, and prints made after paintings. Now, years later, you oversee more than 20,000 or perhaps even 30,000 works on paper at the National Gallery of Canada. And that's spanning from the 15th century to the contemporary period. So do you ever think about how close your current work is to the world that you studied as a scholar?
I do, because it all sort of makes a lot of sense when you think about it. When I came to study art history at McGill University, I knew I was interested in Caravaggio, but of course, so much had been written about that artist in particular, and I was looking for something that was less researched, where I could make a contribution to the field. And the Utrecht Caravaggisti were these three Dutchmen who went to Rome and then eventually imported Caravaggio style back to the Netherlands. And out of their work came out a series of prints, which is really unusual in Caravaggism, because with Caravaggio, a lot of the scenes are night scenes, and night scenes are particularly difficult to translate into print, because that would mean working a plate of metal over and over again in order to achieve really dark tones. So I came upon this series of prints that was sort of rare in the Caravaggisti corpus. And at the same time, I began working at the National Gallery of Canada and was introduced to the fabulous world of prints and drawings. And so the two sort of evolved in parallel. And eventually, really, my knowledge and then that I was gaining at the gallery really helped me sort of consolidate what I wanted to say about these prints in my dissertation. But I haven't thought about this dissertation in forever. I rarely do now, because we don't have any of those works that I discussed in it in the collection of the National Gallery of Canada. So I feel like the two subjects don't intersect much, but they did at one point.
Yes. And what's interesting is that these were prints that you were looking at, and of course you have in this massive body of works on paper, you do look at these prints in different forms, different ways they've been made over the centuries. So that is really interesting to me, how something that you studied in university is still very much a part of your life.
Absolutely. And I think that's, not so unusual for curators who look after historical art. We tend to be highly specialized, and then hopefully, you find a position in that specific field. So that's not so unusual, I think, but it's still nevertheless a huge, I think, privilege to be able to do that. Because I think when I think back to that young student, and what it meant to go into art history, coming from, a family of immigrants, parents who did not have a chance to go to school. Art history was quite abstract, right? I was never taken to museums as a child, so I sort of went into it not knowing where I would land, and I'm so grateful that I'm now really at the head of the most significant collection of works on paper in the country.
Well, I had a privilege of visiting you in this past spring at the National Gallery, and I'm very grateful for that trip, that my husband and I were able to see this extraordinary place of art that I had never visited before. So it's very special in our country, and I can certainly now say that it is a great a place for anyone, Canadian or outside of Canada, to visit. So your office is already in an extraordinary place of art. But what's interesting about you is your office is also very strategically located. So I was thinking of an analogy about a scientist, let's say a marine biologist, right, who is working at a university, but of course, maybe around the springtime goes out into the sea and is doing their work in the field. In your case, your office is actually very close to the drawings vault, where all of these thousands of works on paper, very fragile and very protected, are there. And so you literally can go from, what feels like to me the vault may be your field site, but it is also where the place where your scholarship comes alive, and you have access to touching these works with your own hands almost at any time, I guess that you would like to.
Indeed, and I think that it really is a privilege, and quite a difference from other curators in the museum world in general. So typically, any vault might be, say, in the basement or pretty far off from offices in a museum, whereas the Prints and Drawings Vault at the National Gallery of Canada are located in an area where I actually work. So all I have to do is take 2 steps and be inside my vaults, where I can at any moment hold in my hands the work of Picasso, Chagall, Rembrandt, Dürer. And that's really what I think is different from being a work on paper curator as opposed to paintings or sculpture. With paintings or sculpture, even as a visitor to museums, you usually stand back in order to really fully appreciate an artwork. With works on paper, you actually want to get really up close and intimate. And so there's nothing like holding it in your hands, right? In order to be able to really examine it up close and to look at all that mark making, the signatures, anything on the paper that might signal something about the history of the piece, whether they're collector's marks, because believe it or not, past owners of artworks would stamp the artworks to signal that it had been in their ownership. So that is really an everyday privilege to be able to hold and look at these things up close and without glass in front of them, right? Like I can see the naked paper. Yes. That is a very different experience from viewing things on the walls of museums. And that access, I think, is what makes my job exciting on a daily basis.
And that's the passion that you certainly have, and I no doubt felt that when we met in person. But I also, and I will back up because my relationship to you began actually as a docent when I had the privilege of giving tours at the Audain Museum in Whistler of one of your most recent exhibitions called Gathered Leaves, which was prints and drawings that spanned over centuries, mostly European art, but also North American as well. And it was a extraordinary privilege to speak about the art, about some of those big names that you mentioned, right? But as I say, you get to see them all the time. But let's just back up a bit, because we're in a very controlled environment at the vault. The vault is not a place that anyone can sort of go into. It has high control, but temperature control is a big one. But we're looking at very fragile works. When we think of paper, we can think of the various types of paper that was made over the centuries, and also, but things like parchment or vellum material. These materials are important. And then also the medium, so whether it is paper, ink, chalk, pastel, watercolor, graphite. These are, again, mediums that are fragile, and so they do require certain storage. Can you kind of give us a glimpse of what the vault looks like and what you're seeing?
Yeah, so the reason why all these objects are kept together is because the support, paper, acts very differently than canvas or materials used for sculpture, for instance. It is very fragile, of course, not only because it can be torn very easily, but also because paper can fade or discolor very quickly when it is over exhibited. So typically collections, or I should say, museums of our size tend to have sizable collections of works on paper so that those can be continually rotated in the galleries. So for works on paper, there is no such thing as permanent display. You cannot leave a work on paper on permanent display. And if you have them at home, I mean, I do this at home too, but it will eventually, the paper will the ink or the materials will either fade or the paper will yellow. So you will see the damages of time and light on those works. And so that's why everything on paper is usually kept together in the same vault in a larger museum. Now, it also means that you need a specialized curator to look after these. And that's very different from how other collections might be organized. So for other collections, you might have a curator of Canadian, European art. So you might divide the other collections based on where the artworks are from, not so much what they're made of. So it's a very interesting field because your expertise is not based on an area of the globe or a period in time. It's an area of expertise where you have to know a little bit of everything, but you have to know primarily your material. So paper, is both a common a commodity of everyday life and something that has been used by artists from very early on. And it is, as we've said, both fragile but also very resilient. And that's what explains why we have artworks on paper in the collection that have seen over 5 centuries. And this is also, I think, what always sort of interests me is knowing that if I'm today holding a piece of art that was made 500 years ago on paper, it means that, before me came a whole slew of people who cared for this little piece of paper. Either that or it was completely forgotten about somewhere and preserved in that way. But most of the time it's because they looked after these things and they've been preserved in drawers, in albums, perhaps. So I think one of the questions we get often as curators of works on paper is, why were these collected? When we go to museums, we tend to see paintings and sculpture. Yes, but who could afford paintings and sculptures 300, 400 years ago, right? Not that many people. And so collectors who were interested in art, but perhaps could not afford larger artworks might have decided to collect works on paper. And so that's how sort of that field is sort of takes shapes in a way. It's distinct for that reason. And in that sense, it's similar to photography. Yes. So photography has a much shorter time span, obviously, because of when it was invented. But photographs are typically on paper as well. So they're all kept in the same vault and they're being looked after by a team of people who specialize in photography specifically, not in a specific school like the European or the American or a time period. And so I think that's what makes the field even richer because you have to be highly specialized in works on paper, yet you have to also be a generalist in many ways and cover, in my case, 500 years of history and many different continents. And so the way things are organized within the vault, to come back to your initial question, is that these pieces of paper are usually matted in a mat that can then be inserted into a box where you will find more or less about a dozen artworks together. And then these boxes are shelved on rolling shelves most of the time. So it's not a vault where you might find, thousands of things framed. Things are mostly unframed, actually, kept in very simple mats where you can actually hold them in your hands and study them up close. That's why I was talking about this earlier, because the way things are stored are really conducive to study. You're not standing, face to face with a large framed work. Most of the time, you are holding something in your hands or on the table in front of you. And that really is what allows that intimate connection to the artwork. I don't know how much more I can explain the vault without really, an image of it. And in fact, I think the vaults are a little bit of a mysterious place because typically museums don't advertise, right, what the vault looks like or where it is within the building, and that's for very, obvious reasons.
Yes.
And so it is a bit mysterious as a place, and I hope that through Gathered Leaves, the exhibition that you were able to enjoy in Whistler, we were able to convey a little bit of the types of objects that we have in the vault and the type of research we can do on them and what we can discover about them. Because with 30,000 works in a vault, you will never run out of things to discover, right?
No. And there's a little bit of an emotional side to this, if I may, because I will say that during the end of my tours, when I was giving the tours of this extraordinary exhibition, I would tell them, my guests, that much of that, what we had just witnessed and seen, would eventually have to get their beauty sleep again. And so works on paper can be shown, but for a very limited time. And what was interesting also too about that exhibition, and I'm sure this is the case for many of the exhibitions that you curate, is that for the first time something may have come out of the vault and now be shown to the public because, again, of the fragility, and also, just as you said, there's so many works. But there was a lot of emotion that there was a silence that I felt, that when people felt that they had seen something that was very rare maybe first time shown, but then also knowing that it would go back into the vault maybe for years and not be seen again. They felt they were witnessing something quite special. And I thought that was lovely.
I'm so glad that really came through, because that really was, I think, one of the key effects that we wanted to convey with the exhibition Gathered Leaves, was really that we were almost bringing people into our vault, giving them a chance to view this or that. And that would be sort of a unique opportunity, because a lot of these works won't be seen again for at least another decade. And that makes the exhibition special, because it's the only moment maybe when you might see that particular Kandinsky that we just purchased, for instance. But it also means that we can, because they're works on paper and they're not, large, complex works, they can also travel fairly easily. And so, yes, people could see the exhibition in Ottawa, but we were also able to travel it to Whistler, and it'll be actually opening in St. John's at the Rooms in September. So that's the nice thing about works on paper. They can only be shown, yes, for a certain amount of time, but that time is usually set at about 10 to 12 months for then a period of about, depending, 5 to 10 years of rest following that. But that means that you have 10 to 12 months of exhibition time overall. And so if you have an exhibition in Ottawa for 3 or 4 months, then you can show it elsewhere for another 3 or 4 months. And again, so 3 to 4 venues, I think, is a wonderful thing for Canadians because then they get to experience an exhibition put together by the National Gallery of Canada with works that reside usually in Ottawa, but that can travel fairly easily to other venues and be shown there for a certain amount of months. And then, there's always the catalog after that, right? That's sort of the afterlife of an exhibition. And that's the point also of doing exhibitions is to publish these artworks that are usually kept in the vaults and not seen publicly. And so the catalog is really what remains afterwards of an exhibition. And it's sort of keeps the exhibition alive in perpetuity in a sense, because it really is sort of like it represents the state of the research at the time of that exhibition.
And now finally, I want to touch on a little bit about how works on paper often, in many cases, could have been preparatory sketches. They could have been sort of, as a writer, I see it as kind of the draft, that a writer has. So with sort of the background foray, the scenes behind, behind the scenes. And in many ways, there is a kind of fluidity, of kind of freedom that you can see. And you mentioned Kandinsky and many others, but there are these people that you could see in their drawings. Maybe the artist would be, because it's not necessarily the final, and the final oil painting, for example, would also have to adhere to many things that, like a writer has to, when it comes to publication, when it comes to showing at a certain time, so if you want to show at the Salon de Paris, you're going to have to make sure that you adhere to that. But in the drawing side, it's almost like you can get into the mind of the artist and see what they might have been discovering as they were doing many of these works. So that's another interesting angle that I think gives value to maybe why over 5 centuries someone would have kept those little works on paper. And some of them were very little, at least in Gathered Leaves. So we're talking about, not necessarily big, size works. I did see big watercolors. Some of them were quite large, almost the size of paintings, but many of them were not that large, right? And yet have so much value.
Yeah, I think that you really sort of pinpointed something that is ultra stimulating about working in the field of works on paper is that the functions of drawings are really multiple. So initially you spoke about that, the function of drafting or sketching things, right? And that really allows you to get into an artist's mind. And that in Italian and in Italian art history specifically is what they call the primo pensiero, the first thought.
Yes.
So drawing is really connected to this idea of the primo pensiero. And obviously as a scholar of drawings, that has a great aura, right? You're really getting to experience the artist's hand. You can look at the movement of chalk on paper. When you're looking at painting, you do not get a feel for that sort of thing. Paintings are polished. They're made under very different circumstances than drawing. And so that primo pensiero is, I think, really crucial, a really crucial aspect of drawing. But after that, there are so many more functions of drawing. And that's why in Gathered Leaves, you were able to witness not only very sketchy things that are primi pensieri, but also highly finished works that would have been sold as finished decorative works in and of themselves, right?
Like
the
Rosalba Carrera from
Venetian. That's right.
Yes.
That's right. And with like Rosalba, the medium of drawing becomes ultra interesting because the reason why she chose pastel and paper is because she was becoming she was a portrait painter in 18th century Venice, and she's really sort of recognized as being the one that put pastel on the map as an artistic medium. And, but there's a very concrete reason why she chose pastel, because she made portraits mostly of tourists who came through Venice and wanted their portrait painted by a famous portraitist. But if you're traveling through Venice, you may not have the luxury of sitting for months in front of an artist. And so pastel enabled her to create highly, highly finished and polished portraits in a really short amount of time. She didn't have to wait for paint to dry in between sitting sessions, right? She could just go at it in 1 or 2 session max, and then the artwork would be ready, and the sitter could leave with it back to their city of origin. And so, that kind of function of drawing says a lot about, the art market, about history in general in Venice, for instance, with this particular artist. But it's all these little nuggets of really fascinating information that I love about drawing. I mean, it sounds like it. Yes, it is a highly specialized field, but you gain so much perspective on history in general by studying drawing. And so, you alluded to large watercolors in Gathered Leaves, for instance. And 2 of them were made by an African-American painter, the first to sort of rise to an international reputation in the 19th century, Robert Duncanson, who came to Canada and really, during his time in Canada, helped establish a properly Canadian landscape tradition. Now, he had been known to make paintings in the US. The only 2 watercolors that are known by him are the watercolors in Gathered Leaves. And so that says something about his patrons in Montreal, or what he was trying to do. He was trying to appeal to patrons that he hadn't known before, because he had come from the US. And he is providing them both with paintings that sold for a certain amount of money, and watercolors that sold for a fraction of the price. And in fact, in Gathered Leaves, with the 2 watercolors, we had a handwritten invoice by the artist himself, Duncanson, where you could see the difference in price for a painting and for a watercolor. And if I remember well, the watercolor was $80 at that time, which was still a substantial amount, but quite small in comparison to the painting. And so you can reach a different market by using paper as opposed to canvas and paint. And I think that's, that's definitely one of the pluses of an exhibition like Gathered Leaves, where you're not focused on a single function, whether it be preparatory drawings or highly finished ones. You can really display a whole variety of functions. And people then get a much broader sense of what a drawing is. And it also hopefully made them think of drawing as really the first art form that we often encounter as children, right? Drawing is really universal. It's often the first thing we create as young artists, pen to paper or whatever it may be. And so it's such a universal thing, yet we often sort of don't think of it necessarily as art, right? We always first think of painting and sculpture, but before you have a painting, before you have a sculpture, you have to draw. You have to draw. And so that primo pensiero, we come back to that all the time, right? In our field and in a conversation like this one, because it's that immediate connection to the artist and his or her mark making on a piece of paper. And I think people might wonder what sort of value that has. But if you think, for instance, of the latest Michelangelo drawing put on the market, I mean, that sold for, I think it was $27 million just a couple of months ago. And it's a drawing of a foot. Literally, it is just a foot on a tiny piece of paper. But that appeal of having access to the artist's hand is really extraordinary.
And then Vermont's pastel, the Scream, I had learned because you had Edvard Munch in that exhibition as well, with his seated nude. I mean, I had learned that that was also sold for millions, and I would say that on the tours. But there is it. I'm getting a little sort of goosebumps because I had experienced these works on paper through the glass, through the protection, but yet they still resonate very deeply to me, and I can see those works that became, everyone is drawn to particular works, and of course I had my favorites in that exhibition, but I can see them in my mind's eye. And what's extraordinary is that I had just before I started giving tours, I'd seen Goya in the Prado in Madrid, and so Goya, the painter, the massive painter, and yet then in your exhibition you had these little drawings of his, and then of course fast forward we also had some more wonderful etchings of his at the Odeon in a different exhibition of the Wask collection, but in each case these little drawings I could see Goya, I could feel Goya, I could feel the same Goya that I was standing in front of in the most largest sense, and I think that really shows how special. And a lot of the visitors felt that in this one exhibition, that they could feel connected to something that is maybe so simple, and yet they could feel the energy of the artist that they loved.
And I think, the smaller format, the immediacy of these things are also really brought to the fore by the stories we were able to tell in Gathered Leaves. And with Goya specifically, those 4 sheets came from specific sketchbooks from late in his life, a period of time that is very well documented. And each of those 4 sheets represented sort of events that might have happened during his lifetime. And we were able to identify one of the subjects much more clearly this time. It had been known to be a representation of a criminal being killed, but now we actually found who that criminal was, what happened to him, and all those things. And so, Goya was really documenting history as it was happening. And that's what's great about a show like this is you can tell the artist's story, but also the story that they're telling through their own drawings. And the fact that these are little sketches that he held in his hand, well, and made fairly quickly and inconspicuously, right? Because these were meant to be in his personal sketchbooks, and not to be displayed on walls. So that is also the other, you were saying earlier how it's a privilege to see these things out of the vault. Yes, but also probably a lot of these artists did not intend for these works to be seen by the public, right? And that's
and I
that
would
appeal
actually,
of getting into their
I would
artist's
say
mind.
that, and that would give the element, at least from the visitor experience, even. They felt even more privileged because they're like, yes, maybe the artist never wanted this to be seen. And so we get to stand centuries later to see them. Now let's move a little bit into the gallery space itself, because I wanted to also talk about what, as we were chatting before we came on air here, where we talk about this idea that the curator, in a way, acts in the same spirit of creativity. So when a museum, an art gallery has an exhibition, there is a feeling that is beyond the artwork itself. It's how the art is structured, whether it's chronological, whether it's, in the case of Gathered Leaves, I will mention there were a lot of women artists that were in many ways unearthed, right, from the centuries, may have not been well known even during their time. And those were important pieces, and how you display them. So it's, how do you feel as a curator after doing so many extraordinary exhibitions over the years? How do you think about those decisions, and of course the didactics as well? Because sometimes you only have 60 words maybe to describe something like what you just said about Goya, and so I can imagine there's a lot of complexity in what you do.
Yes. I mean, that's a very difficult process to explain because every exhibition is so different. So, for instance, if you're putting together an exhibition of Picasso's suite of prints, it's 100 prints that were created over a very short period of time. They
Yes.
follow one another. The subjects are quite similar from one to the other. There isn't too much interpretation needed, right? With gathered leaves, it's a whole other beast. You are dealing with 500 years of history, with artists from all over the map. And making sense out of that was a challenge. I won't lie to you. Because the common thread was that either they had never been seen or we had discovered something new about them. So, how do you make themes out of that, right? And we also did not want to present the exhibition like an art history course. We wanted people to just enjoy the art for work for what they were, really, to just be able to stand, take it in, and enjoy it. And so each section sort of had its own little character. Some were based on the media, like the pastel room. Others were based on a subject matter, like the landscape room. But there was a variety of things. There was a room on the Pre-Raphaelites. It was very diverse in that way. And I think it's really the storytelling, what the stories you weave through within each theme, but also from theme to theme, that is what will sort of guide the visitor through a space,
Yes.
and also make it memorable. And that's, I think, there isn't a sort of secret, how do you say, solution to that. It really is dependent on each subject. And adapting an exhibition to different venues
Yes.
is
Yes.
also an additional complication, a fun one.
Yes.
So in St. John's, for instance, the exhibition will look very different than it
Yes.
did in Ottawa and
Yes.
in Whistler.
Yes.
There's a whole section that is no longer there, for instance, and other ones where we've moved things around. But what needs to be preserved, in my sense, is really the stories. If you can still tell a story, then that's really the important part, because that's what people will remember. It's not so much what the exhibition physically looked like or the individual artworks necessarily, but it's the stories woven through it that they'll
Yes.
remember.
And those are decisions that you really adapt, as you said, to the architectural space, to what constraints you may have in any particular place. And of course, there's a whole team of people involved in this as well that go beyond the curator, which of course you have to acknowledge. Even those people that deliver these works on paper. You had one that I know from Kiriko, who is the head curator here at the Odeon Museum, where she explained that a special truck had to transport that beautiful framed which was like the frame and the art was one in and of itself, right? And it was the glass was very, very delicate. So it had to be also in a glass case on exhibition. And then on top of that, transported in a very meticulous way.
That's an artwork, in fact, Farah, that I did not imagine traveling when I first
Oh,
acquired it. It is a piece that was made in Lyon in the
yes.
18th century by Jean-Jacques de Boissieu. And it is still in its original 18th century frame and 18th century glass, making it a
Yes.
very special and unique object that through which I was able to really pinpoint the connections between the artist, the collector that he made it for, and also the framer who produced the frame and the glass, which was also very special because the glass was painted so as to create a false sort of decorative border. And behind this, you still had the original backing to the frame with the original framer's label, where the framer sort of advertises all the products that they have available for collectors of art. And so, when I acquired it, I thought, well, this can never really move from here.
Yes. Yes.
And then in talking to our paper conservator, Ainsley, She said, well, we shouldn't dismiss it right away. We should really try, let's see what we can come up with. And so they found a way of securely traveling it and showcasing it. And I think that it really adds something to the exhibition because it is a unique, very unique object. And it also highlights an artist who's not that well known by the public, which was something we tried to do with Gathered Leaves. But even though the artist may not be that recognized today, he was in his lifetime, and he was very, deeply collected by his contemporaries, and clearly people, those collectors put a lot of time, effort, and money into framing these works, as our visitors could see in the exhibition. But yes, it can be very whereas earlier we were saying how it can be easy to travel exhibitions of works on paper, certain works, including that one, or pastels, for instance. Pastels are hard to travel because the chalk itself, the pastel itself, can actually come off the paper, right? So those have to travel flat, for instance. So every work on paper has its own particularity based on what the materials are. And yes, that takes a whole village to put together, whether it's from the moment we begin to think about how we will crate the objects to what kind of truck is needed to move them, to who needs to be there when we install them. It's a really complex undertaking.
Yes. And for good reason, because it goes back to that word of fragility. These are fragile works, and we want them to keep, outlasting the centuries in the future, right? So it is all of those people behind the scenes that are part of this, but there's also, what occurred to me is that when you're thinking of the next exhibition, and when that comes to mind, initially, then I imagine it's similar in a way to your scholarly side, where you've got to now undertake what could be actually a few years of work before anything comes out, and again, something that the public may not think about when they walk into any gallery or museum, that when we see a special exhibition, this is a labor of love that goes on for several years with many, many people behind that. So maybe you can speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I think one of the things I would say first is when you have a project that just came out, often as a curator, you're already thinking about the next one, right? Wow, so you're advertising and presenting a new project, but meanwhile, you're in your mind, you're already elsewhere, right? Wow. Because you have to get onto that next project, because these take years to put together. And in the case of I'm working on two new exhibition projects, and one of them involves building a new collection that I will then unveil in an exhibition. And
so you're acquiring these pieces.
I'm acquiring pieces, that's right, and also working with a private collector who's been collecting in that vein, so that we have a good base to work with. Not only that, but what I'm acquiring or building as a collection are works by early women printmakers. And by early, I mean pre-1800. Wow. So we're not speaking of Mary Cassatt, for instance. No. We're speaking of women whose names are today virtually unknown. So it requires a lot of digging, a lot of original research, because some of these artists don't even have any biographies. And so it's a project that I think is sort of a package deal in a sense, because I'm building the collection and I'm preparing the exhibition at the same time. But it also means that it is like the difficulties are multiplied in a way, because I'm searching for these objects, not in other museums, but on the market, right? So if you were to do an exhibition where you're borrowing from other museums, you'd be, speaking to your colleagues and asking them if they would lend this or lend that. With this kind of project, I'm, working with whatever's on the market and trying to source out these works that I can purchase for the gallery, and that then will be the basis of the exhibition. So it's something that is really consuming me right now, but also I think it's a delightful thing because the area of early women printmakers is not well researched, not well published. So there's still so much work to be done, but that means that it's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for the National Gallery of Canada to really make its mark in the print field by finding and researching and giving these women artists their rightful place in the history of art. So I'm really excited about this specific project, and I've made already, several discoveries, and I would hope that that's an exhibition that will also travel perhaps internationally, because these women artists today forgotten really deserve to be rediscovered.
Oh, absolutely. And that was no doubt a part of Gathered Leaves that I felt very, very strongly. And so did the visitors. Many of them had said that they had never heard of these women, never had known their names, but were very intrigued and wanted to learn more about them. So you can see how important this type of work is. But also, why don't we just back up a little bit, because there's an interesting element about the founding of this, of the Prints and Drawings department in the National Gallery. But we're getting close to about 100 years where women have been overlooking, women like yourself have been overlooking this extraordinary collection. And I think there's something to be said about that. So maybe you can speak a little bit to some of these great women that preceded you, and some of your colleagues as well, right?
Absolutely. I'm really happy you're asking that question, because the history of prints and drawings at the National Gallery is really fascinating, in that we were the very first curatorial division ever created at the National Gallery of Canada.
Wow.
And so when the position was posted in 1921, it was really advertised as a sort of second in command, someone who could take over when the director wasn't around or the board members weren't around to represent the National Gallery. And it took a couple of years before we found the right person. But in 1928, the National Gallery hired Kathleen M. Fennick, an English woman, who has been hailed as the very first woman curator in Canada.
Yes.
So that's really special. 1928, and she was hired presumably for, just to sort of help us get a grasp on things for a couple of years, but she actually remained for 40 years. And throughout that time, she built an extraordinary collection. She was really an important part of the world of prints and drawings in Canada in general. And in fact, due to all of these accomplishments, during the year of her retirement, I think it was in 1968, she was given the Order of Canada for all of these professional endeavors. And then her successor, Mimi Cazort, also continued that really rigorous work through, I think, about 30 years of career at the National Gallery of Canada. And then fast forward to us now, myself and Kirsten, as well as my other colleague who looks after Canadian prints and drawing, Christine Lalonde. We're a team of women only, and I think we're walking in what is the expression in English, to fill
in good shoes. Absolutely.
And it is an extraordinary legacy that Kathleen Fennick and Mimi Cazort have left us, and we're very proud to be continuing it.
Sonia, I'm afraid we're almost out of time, and I can't believe how quickly this conversation went, and I had many more things that I wanted to talk to you about, but I think you gave us so much, and it's, and I will say this, I've met you now, I feel the passion, I felt it not having met you while I was, and you and Kirsten were the curators for Gathered Leaves, but it was certainly a real privilege to come to Ottawa and to meet you, and of course to have this conversation, because it's what you do that make the visitor experience so special, right? There is that. What's interesting from an academic, it's you can do research and you can publish papers, but when you enter this public space as an academic, you've got this wonderful privilege where then you're now having contact with the everyday person that comes into the spaces, which is really nice, and how that impact of one work of art can I've had people cry on tours, right? Art is very emotional, so it is really special with the work that you do, and I want to thank you as a docent, but also thank you for your time, and I think you've given us just a wonderful glimpse, and all I will say, for anyone listening, visit the National Gallery of Canada. It's extraordinary.
And this is a good way for us to remind Canadians that this is their collection.
Oh,
this is
yes,
the national collection. And, thank you for your kind words, Farah, because what I do is extra special because it is for Canadians.
Yes.
I consider myself a public servant, and I'm here to service Canadians by curating their national collection of works on paper. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and for really being so encouraging and passionate also about what we do.
Yes, yes. So thank you, Sonia.
Thank you about what we do.
Yes, yes. No, and it's incredible that you brought me back to a year ago, where more or less, and it feels like I can see all that artwork just in my mind's eye, which is really. It shows how moving art, even at that little drawing, little very fragile drawings, can you never forget the image. Yeah. So thank you, Sonia.
Thank you, Farah.